First and foremost, let's set the foundation for Dawn Redwood. Dawn Redwood, Metasequoia glyptostroboides. Metasequoia glyptostroboides has absolutely no relationship at all whatsoever to coastal redwood, Sequoia sempervirens, to giant sequoia, Sequoia dendron giganteum. Has no relationship to the slang term of other redwoods that exist in the world. Metasequoia glyptostroboides is an Asian species of plant, prehistoric in terms of its time on Earth, thought to have been extinct, and I believe as recently as like 30, 35 years ago, was found in a remote pocket of the mountains in the super interior portion of China, was propagated, became widely available, and shares the exact same story in history as the Willamai pine out of Australia. The Willamai pine, a dinosaur of plant material, thought to be extinct, a rare water source out in the ravines and canyons of the interior portion of Australia, and they find this genetic growing in this old growth forest, they propagate it, and now Willamai pine, another one of these really unique conifers that's becoming available in nursery cultivation, we are seeing the fruits of Metasequoia glyptostroboides, the Dawn Redwood, now starting to become more well-known, readily available. But the problem with Metasequoia glyptostroboides from a concept of aesthetics, nobody knows what they look like. How do they grow? What do they look like over the course of their lifetime? What are their natural tendencies? Do they hollow out from the trunk? Do the branches grow up? Do they grow down? Are they narrow? Are they wide? Are they flame-shaped? Are they dome-shaped? Are they conically shaped? These are all of the things that we have no clue and no reference for in the world of bonsai creation if we are utilizing the tree to reflect that natural representation in that time span and with those elemental factors acting on a Dawn Redwood. So we really do have a species that we have to understand the technique of how do we get them to develop? How do we get them to ramify? How do we get them to refine? And how do we apply our concepts of the practice of bonsai to this unknown species to be able to maximize its potential and really utilize creativity aesthetically to actually create something that we have no other reference for. And this is what you're seeing in this piece right here. Now I'm going to do another rotation just so you see and talk about a few things. Obviously, simple structural setting. This is a tree that was field grown down at Telperian Farms. If you haven't heard the Telperian's Farm podcast, you definitely need to check it out. You can see some of the product of the field growing process, of the thickening, great movement, interesting character here. And we had all of these kind of slender pieces. Now, obviously, whenever we start to talk about deadwood creation, we do start to look at what is the natural tendency of the tree. We don't have that natural tendency. So I'm going to go ahead and make a transition as we work this piece of material and say, utilizing hollowing out of this internal deadwood to ease the transition from this big base into these more slender, multiple apice trunks, as we see this being apically dominant, right, in terms of its coniferous growth habit. Now, does it flatten out like a bald cypress? It is a deciduous conifer. It does drop all of its leaves in the fall and produce an entirely new set in the spring. I doubt it flattens out like a bald cypress. Because we have such a plethora of growth all over the lower portion of the tree, I'm assuming over the course of time this probably has more of a flame shape in terms of its growth habit. Can we use the branches up and out, or do we drop them down? When we typically see Dawn Redwood handled as a bonsai subject out of straight, upright nursery stock, we typically see people bring the branches down. But if you see Dawn Redwood in the natural environment, most of its branches are moving upwards where it is being grown in botanical gardens, in larger settings where the tree is left to its own devices to form its aesthetic and its structure. Now, obviously, the environmental factors can change that growth habit, but my assumption is Dawn Redwood almost maybe has more of like a cedrus, kind of the Lebanese cedar up and lateral kind of spreading, broader canopy, and that upright form in terms of the angle of its branching. Again, hypothesis only and something that we can assume, but we really need time with the new domesticated pieces that are in untapped areas or uncontrolled environments to show us that aesthetic over the next 100 to 200 years, right? 2-3 generations from now, this conversation will absolutely be identifiable, and there will be assumptions that can be verified by the growth habit of those trees, okay? We're not going to worry about that. We're going to go ahead and we're going to take advantage of the material that we get, whether it's a straight tree and we're going to make a formal upright, whether it's a Dawn Redwood that has more movement to it and we are now integrating that movement with the rest of the decisions in the tree. Let's creatively function with what the material gives us. Let's use the imagination and let's focus today on the pruning practice of Dawn Redwood to ramify them, move them from development into secondary, into refinement. That is actually what all of you want to know. Okay? Now, I want to draw some distinctions to the different types of growth before we even talk about the pruning process, because when we deal with deciduous conifers, we have to understand that there are multiple phases and stages of the growth. So Lonnie, if you can just kind of blast in here to this lowest branch, and we'll start to take a look at these. This is a really important area, and specifically, if we can just kind of zoom in right here to these pieces. Okay, now when we're looking at this, and we start to talk about this, you notice that there's kind of an orange spine forming here. Now this is a frond, okay? And this frond is just a singular needle. And we know this is a singular needle when we talk about this frond because at the base of this frond, you see that bud right there at the base. And there's an even more identifiable one kind of on the top right there. You see that bud right at that base. What this is saying is, this is the photosynthetic mass. This is the leaf. Like a deciduous tree, a maple will always have a bud at the very base of that leaf, right? You have the petiole, and then you've got that bud at the base, that dormant bud, that auxiliary bud. That is what we're seeing here in this formation right here. So if we cut this anywhere along this stem, we're not going to be getting a bud pushing out of this piece. We will lose this branch. It probably will last the rest of the season, I'm guessing, but we will cut down on its photosynthetic capacity by reducing the needle quantity on this compound leaf structure, and that bud right there will grow next year and produce the exact same type of growth. Okay, so even though we see that kind of bronzing of that central stem, we have a singular leaf here. Now here's what's interesting about this. As that starts to bronze and mature, notice that the tip is giving me some bifurcation. Okay, I have two buds here that are starting to elongate. This is the advancement of that structure, of that vascular backbone, maturing and hardening off and accumulating energy to a degree where it is now forming a branch. And we see it forming a branch because we see ramification at this tip. The browning and the bronzing of this is suggesting that this is going to become a part of our structure. This is going to become a secondary branch in our tree. And this is something that if we want to contribute to the ramification of the tree, we should not be pruning, pulling off, defoliating, or reducing, because we don't want to push the growth all the way back to that piece. We want to add this to the tree. Now, if we're saying, hey, I don't want this length to be a part of my tree, but I don't have any buds in here and I can't prune this or it'll trigger the growth to come back into there, herein lies the nuance of Dawn Redwood. Because we have to understand at what point do we become capable of actually reducing the length of these elongated frond-like forms of foliar mass to be able to get ramification tighter in, shorten their distance and length, and have success of them contributing ramification. Okay, I'm going to hop to a more mature piece. And this is just above the branch that we were just looking at, the lowest branch on the tree, definitely slightly weaker. Okay, and I'm going to take this similar frond. Now this frond clearly grew from the bud in that crotch. You can see that there's another mature piece here that's been on the tree at least for 2 years, because instead of that bronze color, it's now turned to an actual lignified branch that has that grayish tone to the bark here, okay? But this bud in the crotch was also activated without pruning, without any stimuli. It was activated by the health and maturity of this branch right here and its expansion to become bifurcation at this region. And as we move out, you start to see how it is bifurcating on its own without any action, okay? And you start to say, okay, are we stuck now with this length being the length that we have? Absolutely not, and here's how we know this. When we start to look across this bronzing, and Lonnie, this is where I'm going to pull you in here so that we can really see this, okay? When we start to look at this bronzing, Josh, go ahead and transition out to the wide and let Lonnie pull in, because this is so small and so detailed. Okay? All right. And I'll keep my scissors right at that point so that we can see that. Let me know when you got it. Beautiful. Okay, Josh, bring us in. Okay, now when I flex that, Along these maturing stems, as they start to get more established, we form these little tiny adventitious buds, and you can see just that green little BB right at the tip, right at the base of that needle, right at the tip of my scissor, okay? Behind where the ramification sits here, I have the opportunity to shorten this, and there's a bud right there that is set up. What that is telling me is this has now reached a state of maturity where this is definitively going to stay on the tree over the course of wintertime. It has developed a backbone to become woody, and it is actually setting up adventitious buds in the crotches of the needle. So the Dawn Redwood has moved from this foliar mass being a frond or a leaf to it maturing its vascular system to the degree that it is now becoming a branch. And this is the transition that we have to allow this growth to go to or go through if this is going to remain on the tree over the course of time, okay? So when we start to look at this and we start to understand this transitional component and capacity of Dawn Redwood, when it produces this spring flush of growth, every single one of those pieces of growth is a green frond. It is a leaf at that point in time. And just like a bald cypress, when a bald cypress pushes out, another deciduous conifer, and we've talked about the similarities of bald cypress and Dawn Redwood as deciduous conifers with this frond-like growth habit. A bald cypress pushes out, and each piece of green is only a leaf at that point in time. As they mature, you're going to have certain leaves that are going to have the strength and the vascular allocation and the accumulation of hormones to start to elongate, and that's when we're going to see the bronzing of that vascular backbone that shows the formation of phloem and shows the more complex differentiation of that leaf turning into an actual branch. And it's when we see that bronzing that on a bald cypress we can come back and prune, get another flush of ramification, and hopefully have enough time in that season for that second flush of ramification to harden off and remain on the tree. Now when we talk about Dawn Redwood, we have that same nuance. And when I say they can be handled the same way, it's that same nuance, right? On this lower branch that we've been looking at right here. And just to come back to this and understand, right? We have the bud in the crotch. The bud in the crotch has not been encouraged to grow yet because this is not mature enough for this piece to want to produce a second flush of ramification. It's going to lose this currently because it hasn't been strong enough to really turn into a branch. It is starting to bifurcate, so maybe between now and the fall, it might mature enough to stay on the tree, or maybe it gets dropped and that bud at the base starts to elongate next spring. But if this does mature, we can assume that next year this bud is going to be pushed as a new soft piece of growth and will go through the same maturation process, and this piece that's on it is going to start to continue to mature, to lignify, and to become a piece of secondary ramification on the tree. And when that happens, when it starts to mature, we're going to see that bud formation, and I'm going to hop back to here, okay? Because now as we see this piece mature, we recognize on this more ramifying piece of growth, where we have that bud, at this point in time in the year, I can cut back to that bud. I can stimulate that growth to produce ramification tighter in on that elongated piece, and now I can start to reduce and shorten the frond-like growth of Dawn Redwood to dependable areas where that budding is going to take place. Okay, so we're walking through the stages of growth, all right? First stage is just a leaf. It's a compound leaf, it's a complex leaf, because this is a frond. That leaf photosynthesizes, accumulates energy, and starts to create its own backbone of vascular structure in terms of a cambial layer and phloem. We see the bifurcation occur at the tip. The continued perpetuation of that maturity is it does not fall off in the fall season. It stays on as a branch. And next year, it continues to mature and lignify as a branch, and the bud at its base becomes a secondary piece of ramification. There is nothing to be done to this piece this season or this year. We have to leave it to grow, okay? When we have those pieces form that vascular backbone, turn that bronze color, we see it start to ramify at the tip, and we can identify buds back in on the interior that are set up as adventitious buds. That's your key and that's your clue. Bronzing, ramified tip, presence of buds that are identifiable. I now have the capacity to shorten that, to hope that that produces another flush of ramification, and that ramification that's produced can mature between now and the end of the season to stay on as a next flush of ramification. And again, I want to say this. With bald cypress, Taxodium disticum, Sometimes we prune, we get second flushes of ramification, and they mature enough to stay on. The earlier that we see that elongating stem turn bronze and prune, the greater the chance the second flush matures and stays on the tree and doesn't fall off in the fall. The same will be true for the Dawn Redwood. When we see those buds and we cut back to those buds, the longer that they have to elongate, harden, and hopefully establish the vascular backbone like we're seeing in this bottom piece, where it's ramifying at the tip, we have the bronzing, which shows phloem formation, the more likely we're going to get 2 flushes, 1, and if this had those buds and we cut to them, 2 in this singular season. This piece doesn't have that capacity, but this piece did have that capacity. This piece had that potential by the identification of those buds, by the greater degree of ramification at the tip, adventitious, we cut. I do feel like this is a little late to have that bud flush and stay on the tree. Harden off and stay on the tree over the course of the fall. So I'm not going to be doing super aggressive pruning because I do feel we're too late in the season to have that work out. And if that's the case, it either might not flush from that bud or it may flush back from the base because we cut it a little bit too late. But I wanted to show you, because it's been such a big question, how do we handle Dawn Redwood? We have to learn to analyze the growth and how we manage it. And I will also say this. In the management of Dawn Redwood, you have a striking similarity to the Willamai pine and the nuances of Willamai pine found in Australia that correlate. Although it's not a deciduous conifer, it has frond-like growth. This is a very prehistoric growth habit that we see in the frond-like growth. And there are nuances to this in terms of how they correlate and how they relate. Dawn Redwood and bald cypress, but Dawn Redwood and Willamai pine in terms of this rare maturation that forms understandable budding and how we handle it, okay? So this is the youngest, this is the next stage, okay? I want to walk you into a more mature rendition of this in terms of a branch that's really started to take off and establish itself, okay? So let's go ahead and zoom in here, Lonnie, and let's take a look at what we're dealing with, okay? Now, when we start to talk about shape manipulation, strength transition, or developmental processes to grow out one of these branches and gain that thickness, okay? Now we start to see what we would anticipate in terms of that opposing bud formation of a very mature woody twig here, okay? We've got a nice lignified branch. This is 2 years after the pieces we just looked at. You've got these adventitious buds, which is what we cut back to on that piece we just talked about, the cut back. Those buds, had we not cut back, would start to form these opposing branches of ramification as that piece lignifies and emerges, okay? And then at the tip, we see that elongating green fleshy growth right here, and we see that backbone starting to turn that bronzing color. That's the piece, that's the extension that we will get this year if we do not touch it and we do not prune it, okay? Now, as I look at this now, if we say, gosh, I don't want that to elongate, I'm going to go ahead and prune it. Well, hang on just a sec. Do we actually have buds set up where we could prune that back and depend on a bud pushing from that bronze location? I don't see any mature buds back in here on this location. Well, is that set up and is that mature enough to be reduced? Well, here's what I know. I see buds at the very base of the crotch of these newest fronds, which is showing you this elongated, this ramified, and I've got growth at the very base of this that if I went ahead and I took this frond off, or I took this frond off, or these fall off in the fall, my growth starts again from the tip of that piece, and this is ramification the tree has already committed to keeping. That is interesting. This is the observational understanding of how Dawn Redwood behaves, where the maturity process goes, how we can anticipate if it is something we can prune or if it is a piece of growth that hasn't reached the kind of maturation where we could assume we could prune, okay? And so as we go through each piece of this and you look at the possibilities of can I prune or can I not prune, you are analyzing what that specific branch, that specific shoot, or that specific leaf is doing in terms of its presence of buds, the color of that stem, and the ability for those buds that exist on that stem to indicate that it is mature enough to be able to shorten that length of foliar mass. And we can rest assured, confidently, that if that leaf has any value to the tree, it will start to ramify. It will start to create adventitious buds along that run, as that is when the leaf turns into a branch. This is the complexity once again. Now, I'm sure, I have no doubt, all of you are sitting there going, I am so much more confused right now than when I started. Like, I just want to cut it. I just want to cut a Dawn Redwood, and I want to have it work. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, right? I can't even tell you how sorry I am that it is this complex of a tree. We spent an hour and a half last night on a tree, on an Austrian black pine this big, talking about the decandling process and the nuances of that. And the majority of the time was spent analyzing that growth and discussing the nuances and really hammering home the fundamentals of that operation. When we deal with species that exist outside of the norm, there are not many deciduous conifers in the world, and they behave differently. There are not many pines of the nature of Pinus nigra or the Austrian black pine that behave like that. We see these outliers, and it challenges our concepts because they don't fit inside of the box of what we understand to be true. And most of us are still trying to get a handle on what is an elongating species. How do we handle a spruce or a hemlock or a redwood or a bald cypress? And now all of a sudden we're talking about Dawn Redwood that isn't a regular redwood, and it's a deciduous conifer, so it drops its leaves, and because it drops its leaves, we have to understand where that piece of growth is in its stage of hardening off to become a piece of ramification on the tree, and we can't shorten it, and now all of a sudden there's a bud there and we can shorten. Yeah, this is what it looks like. This is why this is such a complex piece, okay? And it's why I wanted to come back to it, because we recognize that there are multiple opportunities to prune Dawn Redwood, to be able to control its growth, manage its growth, and have it respond in a way that is refinable, okay? So when I start to get into these areas where I have these pieces that are starting to create ramifiable growth, and they are elongating and they're getting stronger, I am very comfortable at this point in time to come back in and prune these back to a junction, to shorten that woody tissue. I'm very happy to come back into this base where I don't need a new piece of ramified growth to be sucking the energy out of that, and I'm gonna clean that out, which does intuitively push the strength in to these pieces now starting to harden off and ramify and hopefully create that bifurcation. When I get out onto these elongating pieces where I have really long frond-like growth, I'm always going to be looking back at the base. Do I have a bud here? I see I have a bud here. Do I have buds along this elongating piece of growth? I notice that there is bifurcation. I do not have buds along this elongating piece of growth. I cannot shorten this piece. I cannot shorten this piece. What I could do is I could come back in and I could shorten this branch. I can very easily shorten that branch. Now I'm back to another situation where I'm analyzing this piece. Can I shorten this piece? I see a bud at the base. I do not see buds out on that elongated shoot. I cannot shorten that piece. That is the extent to which I can prune that region and that specific location on the tree. Here's where I'm going to really get messy, though. Here's where it's going to really get nasty. Because when I start to get up into these really, really vigorous pieces, okay, and Lonnie, go ahead and come in tight here, and let's take a look at what we're dealing with, okay? This is when it starts to get very, very interesting. Okay, and this is a difference in terms of strength and strength alone. Because what we've been talking about to date are really nice, fine, frond-like pieces of growth at the lower portion of the tree. But obviously, Dawn Redwood and every conifer, for the most part, right, outside of a creeping or a crawling conifer, most conifers are apically dominant. And what that means is the upper canopy of the tree is going to show strength. Now, in this piece that just started growing this spring, we have robust vigor. We've got robust ramification. We've got a much thicker growth habit. And consequently, when I start looking into the crotches of these things, I have a bud here, I have buds there, I have buds there, I have buds there. I have buds at 7 different internodes along this run right here. The tree is clearly saying, this is one of my grand champions. This is going to be a piece that's going to elongate, that's going to become apically dominant, that's dominant at the tip. And we've got to decide how long or short do we want this piece to be in the design of the tree. And this is where we start from the bottom of the tree and we work our way up. Go ahead and blast out, Josh, so they can see where this is at. Okay, we start from the bottom of the tree making those decisions and we work our way up. But when we get into these upper areas, right, and let me just show you this from the front, and I'm going to step over even though the camera's a little bit tight over here. Okay, this is actually my defining branch on the tree, or one of the potential defining branches on the tree, depending on how, and I'm assuming that's going to be up a little bit. So now you see this being a defining branch. I may want that to elongate. Now I have these pieces of ramification overlapping each other, and I'm going to want to bring order to that via wire, but I'm not going to want to do that right now when they're so soft and supple. And I've got these ramifiable pieces of growth, and go ahead and blast in tight where Lonnie's at, because this is a beautiful shot, okay? I've got these pieces generating length here. I've got these pieces more towards the front of the tree that I'm going to need to organize and wire. And I've got these pieces that are overlapping, these pieces underneath it, and need to be shortened. So naturally, even if I want length to occur here for my defining branch, I've got to pull back these top pieces because they are as long as my branches on the bottom, and this is again where I come in. And I start to find what length. I've got buds here, 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 and I have ramification there. Where do I want this length to be? I'm going to keep this nice and tight and compact. Boom. Okay? I'm going to cut that back to the most interior set of buds. I'm going to keep it tight, I'm going to keep it short, and I'm going to start that ramification as far towards the interior as possible. Let's take a look at this one, okay? I've got buds all the way out here. My first bud set starts all the way out here. I've got buds here, I've got buds here, and I've got ramification here. I'm going to shorten that. Boom, okay? So now when we start to look at this, where we had these top pieces overgrowing this entire branch, now they're really nice, short, tight pieces of ramification that are going to start to bifurcate, okay? These are coming towards the front of the tree. I don't want these to be super long and dominant, but they need to be longer than the pieces above them. This is where we say there is a similarity between Don Redwood and Bald Cypress. On Bald Cypress, we don't have to identify a bud. On Don Redwood, we do. But we still have the capacity on these really strong shoots to start to look at where do those buds become present, and if this is a piece that's over the top, this piece on the bottom needs to be slightly longer. So even though I could compact this and shorten this, I'm going to leave it just a little bit longer so that when you start to look at this, this piece is nice and long, this piece is nice and short and sits over the top of it, and I've created an interior and an exterior branch. I've created a hierarchy where this bottom piece will always be able to photosynthesize because it's longer than the top piece above it. Okay? So I'm going to do the same thing here, where I'm going to be looking, I'm referencing the length on top here, I'm going to leave this just a little bit longer, and now all of a sudden I've got that there. And now we start to see, oh, in that pruning, I've also given this a nice triangular form to give me that directional insinuation. I'm going to make this my terminal tip of my defining branch. I'm going to prune this piece back just to shorten it a little bit, and I've all of a sudden created, when we wire this out next spring, when these harden off and we come back and we set this up for growth next spring, I've created that triangular tip that gives rise to shape in my Don Redwood. Let's continue moving towards the interior, okay? And I'm going to rotate slightly towards Lonnie again, okay? And Lonnie, let's focus right in here on this area, because here we start to see structural flaws, right? And the structural flaws that we're seeing is we have these two branches at a singular junction. I'm not upset at that. But we have this branch that exists on the other side of it. And we start to say, okay, do we want to save this one that's on the front side of the branch, or do we want to save one of these two on the back side? We have 3 branches in this area, plus the main branch. We can only save 2. Main branch is 1. We can only save this one, or this one. Which one are we going to utilize? Well, I start to look at the region around it. Where is this branch in relation to this, right? Where is this branch in relation to this? Well, this branch is far closer and already bumping into this piece of growth. So I'm going to guess that my natural staggering of my branches is going to need to open up space here to make room for this foliar mass, right? And then I'm going to save the one that has the acute crotch moving towards the tip of this branch because we are seeking that triangular shape. And I'm going to call that good. Now you might ask yourself, well, this is an interior branch right here. Why not shorten that to its very shortest internode? Because this doesn't have the same thickness as these pieces. These pieces are thick. These pieces are starting to lignify. These pieces have back buds all over them. They are strong. They are set up. They are ready to have this kind of pruning that really prepares them to become ramification and be wired out next year. This one is soft. This one just barely has the beginning of buds forming. I want it to be a little bit thicker, I want it to be a little bit stronger. So I'm going to go ahead and leave this year, knowing next year it will look a lot stronger and I can cut it back to those buds that exist. I have opportunities. I have options on Don Redwood, and I want to exercise those options. In all actuality, as complex as it seems when we start, Don Redwood is quite conducive towards really opportune moments to be able to make these selection processes. But the same strategy as a deciduous conifer, the same strategy has to apply. Okay, because when you have a deciduous conifer, right, it's not deciduous and it's not fully conifer. It moves more water than a conifer, it moves less water than a deciduous. When we talk about a Japanese maple or a trident maple, partial defoliation prune, you can do this 2 or 3 times a year. Why can you do this 2 or 3 times a year? Because it's moving water fast enough as a pure deciduous that it can replenish its foliar mass, and that foliar mass can harden off as branching prior to being dropped in the fall. And it can do that 2 or 3 times. Why do we have to be so careful about pruning our deciduous conifers? Because they're moving more water than most of our conifer species, but they aren't moving so much water that we can partially defoliate or prune and have that next flush of growth elongate and fully harden off before it drops it in the fall. And this is where I would say this kind of an operation is definitely something that we want to do as early as we see these characteristics forming. Bronzing of that backbone, just like a bald cypress. Analysis of the maturity of that piece of growth, which is unique now to a Don Redwood, right? And then making the decision of, do we want to prune and try to stimulate another flush of ramification this year? And if so, how does that aesthetically fit into our tree? How is our timing for the remainder of the year? And are we going to have the capacity for that second flush to fully mature? Now, I've made some prunes on a few different branches. I need to consistently apply this to the entire tree. And I do believe, even though we're in the tail end of July, that we have enough heat generating over the course of this summer, and we have a long enough fall in the Pacific Northwest that I still can squeak out another flush that's going to fully mature. But this is going to be experimental, and I would tell you all that I do think the tail end of July is a little bit too late to do this. I'm going to apply it to the tree. We're going to experiment with this, and I do predict that it will be positive. Otherwise, I would not roll the dice. But I would say, if generally I'm teaching about this application of technique, I would say do this earlier than what I'm doing right now. Through the majority of North America, Europe, and the Northern Hemisphere, you need to be doing this earlier. When you see that bronzing, middle to tail end of June is probably your wheelhouse to have that time for that growth to occur, harden off, and give you ramified growth when we start to talk about a ballpark range and timing for that to occur, okay? So I'm just gonna come back here, and I'm gonna readdress the tree now. Instead of really diving in on that macro level, right? I'm gonna zoom out and start to really work with the tree in terms of what I want to accomplish aesthetically. Okay, now, when I dive into these pieces here, I want to again be thinking about, okay, I don't have the maturity. This is lower down on the tree. I'm just seeing the bronzing of the central piece. I'm very happy to directionally start to give rise to where I want ramification to solidify, where I want to kind of shorten and redirect energy. And these pruning decisions are transitioning energy from the tip back into the interior, back into some of those different buds. Okay, so I've got this dominant tip here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to keep this dominant. And I'm going to go ahead and these pruning processes right here, again, are because these are not nearly as mature of pieces of ramification where we can be actually pruning the frond-like growth itself. But I do want to be managing that growth. Now, I may want a little bit of elongation at this tip, so I'm going to leave this. When I come back into these areas, I want to be forming that staggering. And here is a perfect example of this difference of growth. Okay, and I'm going to rotate so Lonnie can zoom in here. Okay, this piece on the left, this is a needle. Okay, consider that a compound leaf. The piece across from it is a ramifying branch. What is the difference? Why did this become a ramifying branch and why is this still a leaf? And could this leaf become a ramifying branch? Absolutely. I don't know what causes this differentiation, but I recognize this differentiation exists. Even though it exists, I know that this piece can be a leaf. I'm going to take off that branch because I go from the right to the left to my bifurcation at the tip, and I set up a stagger pattern where these still have time for the remainder of the season to mature and turn into ramifiable growth. Okay? So I'm actually selecting, much like we did on the bald cypress, alternating where we leave the leaves after that pruning in the summer season, alternating to set ourselves up for really beautiful branch structure and really beautiful branching design. Okay, as I move up into this tree, I have some really aggressive pieces that are starting to push, and notice that these are almost forming a multiple apice, okay, almost forming a multiple apice kind of style and structure. It's this kind of observation. Go ahead and come in tight for me, Josh. It's this kind of observation where you see these two pieces growing upwards and they're both growing with apical dominance. That is what gave rise to the nuance of this entire design. Okay, but I don't necessarily know that I want both of these to be an apical region, and in fact, it feels to me like this is really starting to impose upon my branches over here. I'm going to pull this back. I'm going to say instead of an apical region, you are going to be a branch, and as a branch, you're not going to elongate into the next branch in the sequence of events that occurs. Okay, this branch right here, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take off any buds of pieces occurring around it. I'm going to establish my stagger pattern of ramification on the pieces that I leave behind, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to decide, do I want this to be that long? No, I do not. So I'm going to go ahead and cut back into there and reduce that growth. Now you start to see some branch formation. You start to see the frond-like habit having organization. You see the spacing created by that staggered effect of the foliar mass. That is giving rise to a beautiful branch structure that over the course of the remainder of this year is going to mature and is really going to start to form the backbone of a beautiful ramified piece of growth. Let's come back to here. Okay? Now we're over in this region. We're starting to establish some strength. I don't want this to continue to elongate. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut that back. I've got shoots at the base of this. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take those off to get that staggered effect. Okay, and I'm going to say I don't want this continuing to grow vertically, so I'm going to stop that vertical elongation. And I'm going to stop that vertical. Let me see if I have buds. I don't have any buds there. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stop that at the lignified portion there. I'm going to reduce that so I have my staggered effect. That's cleanliness and that is accuracy, okay? I have this area right here. Now, bear in mind, this is the one that I cut back to the green bud we had identified right there. I have two really beautiful branches at this singular junction, and then I've got a stub. And notice this little tiny piece of frond out here, okay? With my hand in front of it, you see those fronds. I have far more quality in terms of ramification on these two pieces. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to drop my wire back, and this is a very common thing when we cut Don Redwood back for the first time in an initial styling. We will have them push on bare wood, right, where the buds existed that we're seeing form. We will have them push on bare wood, but when I get these finer pieces of ramification that are lignifying and showing strength, I'm going to cut that bare wood back and I'm going to find the space for that foliar mass to exist. Okay? Now when I come underneath here, all the way on the interior, you're seeing a lot of growth coming from a singular shoulder here. Again, those are those buds. When this was just a frond, because this woody branch was just a frond at one time, and we know that bud forms at the crotch of that frond because that frond is only a leaf when it emerges, and it accumulates those buds as meristematic tissue. This is what you get. You get this conglomeration of growth that accumulates in that region. I want to clean that out. I don't want all of that quote-unquote crotch growth occurring in that area of the tree, okay? Now down here, and you see this through the tree, this is perfect, right? This is a branch that I don't want to be cutting or shortening. If it's valuable and it deserves to be a part of the design, I have to, in the developmental process, leave as much strength and as much foliar mass on that as possible, or else it will not elongate. If I want either of these two branches to develop density on the interior here as lower branches on the tree, I have to leave these tips elongating, growing, developing, and thriving, okay? So these lower pieces, because of the apical dominance, because of the lopsided distribution of strength, the only thing I might be doing is staggering the cleaning and the layout of the branching ramification. Beyond that, I'm not going to be impacting those areas that need more strength. Okay, and you can obviously see what's happening here. Much like any other tree, as we continue to clean out, we're leaving more on the weaker pieces. We're going to be taking more off of the stronger pieces to pull them down to the strength and the density of the weaker pieces. And this process of pruning, much like with the bald cypress, ends up with a density and evenness of distribution that now creates the same priority in the lower branches as the upper portion of the tree. In the bonsai process, this is what distributes energy and balances the strength of the tree over the course of the entire silhouette. Okay? Now, as I move through the middle portion here, I again am confronted with a similar scenario where I've got these dominant branches that are starting to show a little bit of apical dominance, okay? Now, I want these to be bigger, I want these to be thicker, I want these to be stronger, or else proportionally they don't fit on this trunk, right? These are nice and small and fine and skinny. This is a big trunk, and I've got bigger branches. Go ahead and just pan a little bit up there. Got these bigger branches. Notice that structural presence, okay? These skinny pieces here, I want these to have this same structural presence. That means I can't be pruning back the tip. So the extent of which I'm going to be handling these, taking pieces off of the base, right at the base where they originate, I've got a bifurcation of 2 here, and then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work on that staggered effect. Okay, I'm going to stagger, I'm going to stagger, and I'm just going to lay out the staggered design to have a distribution of energy. These are strong, but I'm reducing the foliar mass slightly so that they don't overtake anything else on the tree, and that balances out that area. I'm letting these elongate in a developmental form, okay? So if you zoom out for a second, Josh, right, what we start to see is, and I do this strategically so that you can see the differentiation. Notice the density on the left side of the tree, and there's still a little bit of work to be done up here. Notice the density on the left side of the tree. Notice the aesthetic on the left side of the tree. Things are more laterally laid out. There's sparseness, there's space, there's light penetration, there's air circulation. Notice on the right side, right? The right side has to echo what we've accomplished on the left side of the tree. And again, we are working through the stages of how mature is that green piece that we are thinking about cutting. Does it have the bronze backbone? Does it have backbudding? If it does have backbudding, does it have a lot of it, and how long do we want it to be to fit inside of our design, right? The more mature, the more strong, the more established the growth, the farther back we can cut and transition into that next phase of ramification. Let's continue. Let's continue. And I'm just going to basically kind of stream of conscious dialogue through this process with you. Now, as we move into the back here, we start to get into some of these longer areas. And this is where, this is still very much a Don Redwood in development, but we want to start to get that out, in, and back out again. And these were left really long. And I'm going to rotate so Lonnie can show you what's happening here. Okay, these were left really long because we did not have all of these interior pieces that were being that were growing and were utilizable for the tree. So you see this long tip that was left on it because we didn't have something else. This was wired and styled when it was out of foliar mass. Now I've got beautiful ramification at that point where I can come back in and I can drop back to that ramification to begin this process of reducing and creating that in-out environment and that in-out movement. Let me grab my wire cutters here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take that off. Okay. As I move back into this region, I have some longer branches down below that are starting to encroach and clog up that space. I'm going to keep those nice and short and tight. Okay? And this becomes more, I think, when we start to talk about length and the differentiation of length, this becomes more a factor of how long do you want the branches to be hinges on how big or how small the scale you're representing through your design is attempting to convey, right? Because the longer the branches get, when we start to talk about bonsai design, right? The longer these branches get in terms of lateral distance, the shorter this tree feels. The more narrow these branches become, the longer and taller this tree feels. And we think about that scale and that proportion. If this is going to be a giant Don Redwood, which Don Redwood, not a coastal redwood, so not the tallest tree in the world, but definitely a conifer that is driven by oxen, has apical dominance, and is going to reach significant heights in terms of its physical capacity to grow vertically, I'm going to narrow the silhouette to show that length. And that's where some of these decisions of how long does this branch need to be, consistently as a design concept, I'm going to reduce their length once they've achieved that strength and that size in terms of girth and diameter to drive that vertical, narrow, tall, scale and proportion in the design, okay? And when I get up into these pieces, even these pieces in the very top here are starting to get to a point where we didn't know that we were going to have this piece of ramification, and we didn't know whether it was going to grow, so we left this super long. But now that we're at this point, I'm going to come back in here. I'm going to be cutting that wire so that we still have function to guide the position of this piece. And I'm going to go ahead and take that off and just say, hey, listen, I don't need this to be thicker. I definitely don't need it to be that long. Let's go ahead and start reducing that region of the tree so that we're able to control that scale and that perspective that we just discussed and the opportunities to maximize design. Okay? In some of these other regions, I'm getting nice strong branches, but I've got multiples. And let me just show you what I'm talking about here. Okay, Lonnie, can you zoom in right there? Can you see that fork that occurs? You have that? Right there. Yeah, and pull back just a little bit. Okay, so when we get into the upper canopy of the tree, we are going to have these areas. Again, major branch, the more dominant piece here on the left, the bud that existed at that crotch emerging as a thinner branch. My Don Redwood, the character of this tree with the branching, is up and out. So instead of keeping the piece that gives me the best drop branch, I'm moving up and out. I'm going to keep my dominant piece here. My dominant piece has a tremendous amount of ramification. Now that I've made that selection, I want to stagger my growth on that dominant piece. And if I have the capacity in these longer pieces of back budding, let me check. I don't see any capacity there. I don't see any capacity to reduce there. But I do have the capacity to reduce to ramification there. That's the move. That's the move. It's this step-down process. Can I shorten it from the tip? Do I have buds? Do I have interior ramification? Or do I just have a bud at the base and I got to go hands off? Okay? This takes us around, and let me just kind of clean up some of these interior pieces because we are moving through the tree relatively quickly, and some of these are more or less just impediments visually at these junctions where we have, I think, a lot less opportunity to reduce. I'm going to go ahead and continue working on the stagger. Stagger, stagger, always that alternating capacity to reduce, okay? I have a piece of ramified growth here. This is another one. Let's take a look at this just in terms of the handling of Don Redwood, and this is more of a bonsai concept than anything else, okay? When we get into this area here, I have this tiny little frond on this side. I have this ramified twig on this side, and then I have this small piece at the base of that ramified twig. These are coming from the same region, right? Now, a lot of us would take this piece off of that shoulder and leave this little tiny dinky piece here, but we have this central stem that exists in the middle, and that creates that old bullhorn, right, where we have that obtuse angle of that crotch. Instead of doing so, I'm going to cut that central piece out. I'm going to take off that piece on that side, and I'm going to keep the acute crotch between those two pieces that exist right there. There you see that acute crotch right there, okay? That's the move to improve ramification. Now I want to see, do I have a bud? Oh, there you are. I've got buds right there. Boom, I'm going to drop that back because I don't want it to be any longer. Do I have any buds here? I have no buds on that piece. It's not as mature, it's not as strong, it's not obviously at the apical tip. I've got some buds in here. I'm going to drop this back to a bud there. What do I have here? And these, again, these are stronger pieces that are up closer to the apex. I don't have a bud there, it's not as strong. I don't have a bud there, it's not as strong. That's the extent that I can reduce and prune that piece, okay? I'm going to come back up into here. I'm looking at my other pieces. I'm going to shorten these. I don't want these to continue to be coarse. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to work towards my stagger in terms of ramification. I see that I can shorten this to start to reduce. Okay, I've got this big, big aggressive piece up here, okay? And I look at this and I don't want this to elongate anymore, and I see all of these buds. I've got buds here, I've got buds here, I've got buds here, I've got buds here. I'm going to go ahead, boom, I'm going to shorten that as tight as it can possibly be. That reduces that length, that reduces that strength, that reduces that density, okay? Some of these interior branches, I'm going to go ahead and leave and let them develop and let them get longer and stronger. And you say, well, how do you make that decision, right? So I've got this piece in here that kind of tucks into the back, right? This nice piece, it's coming off of the trunk, it's very fresh, it's very new. I don't want to take the tip off of that, right? Why do you not want to take the tip off of that? Well, because proportionally, the branches that exist, and let me just show you that, okay, the branches that exist around that are so much thicker and so much more lignified and mature. And then you have this dinky little piece here that clearly has the strength to contribute, and I would love to have a piece of foliar mass. Look at that hole, right? When you start to talk it, there's a big hole right there in terms of my design. I would love for that to develop into a mature branch. If that's the case, and we're filling it with ramification, as tempting as it is to shorten things, let it develop. Let it thicken, let it lengthen, let it lignify, and then we can come back because you now see how malleable the pruning process is. And as we continue to step back periodically and look at the progress that we're making in this, we start to recognize, oh, this happens very quickly. This is happening very quickly. Like the transition that we're making throughout this tree as we're working it is quite rapid, and it's quite dramatic in terms of what we're capable of achieving. Okay, I'm going to shorten these. I'm on the back side. I recognize you can't see this, but I just want to expedite the process, and I'm going to stagger. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to shorten this piece down here because I don't want that. And this is giving you a really grand view. You can see the apex is getting pulled into the same density. I still have a little bit here. That's kind of a little bit awkward. I don't think I want this. to be quite as long as it is. It feels a little bit cumbersome. It feels a little bit out of proportion. Let's see if we can pull this back a little bit. And I'm actually going to pull this back all the way in just to change the dynamic of this piece and its function inside of the design. And by pulling that back, we really do kind of create a nice density distribution, height, etc., that pushes the tree that way, right? This tree clearly comes up and moves out, and it is an up and out, right? It's not an up, out, and down, sure, right? Moving in that direction, carrying some of that nuance that we're seeing the apices represent. It's trying to constantly latch on to a consistency in design. And again, this piece of material, very young, very raw. It's only been wired once. A student of Mirai, Michael's hopefully watching today. Fantastic response to your work, Michael. I love the aesthetic that it's creating, and we're just elevating its quality and its characteristics as we move it forward, okay? Now, I could go through the rest of this and really kind of finish it out, but I feel like do you think we should go through the rest of it? What time is it? It's an hour. We're an hour in. Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it. If you guys have things to do, I completely understand. I'm going to continue to drive the point home. Let's not stop here. Let's go through the rest of it because we've gained some momentum. We've really kind of started to accumulate a thought process. And whenever we start to gain this momentum in terms of bonsai work, don't lose it. Don't lose it. Don't let it stop. Keep driving forward because once you're in the mode of bonsai, and it takes a minute when you sit down with a tree to acclimate and really start to understand what are we doing, what does this tree need, how do we go about handling it. Once you work it out, once you've met the tree and you're simpatico with where that tree is at, you got to go. Because that relationship, it takes time to conjure every time that you sit down and you work on a tree. You really do have to facilitate again that relationship and that nuance of understanding where each of you are orienting from. And I know it's like really weird when I put like this anamorphic kind of quality and character on the tree of like we're buddies and like we're meet. But when you're working with something as intimately, especially when we talk about the root work, especially when we talk about the energy systems and really controlling, and especially when we talk about making choices that impact the function and aesthetics of the tree, it does become, I think, very personal in the bonsai practice and the relationship that we forge with that tree, having and understanding and respecting our position inside of the functions and activity of that tree and the future success and health of the energy system as a whole, okay? Now, when I get into these stronger areas, I'm going to start looking more closely at trying to control the strength of the actual tips because this part is getting so long. This part has been pulled back to a significant degree, the strength has been checked to a significant degree, and now we're getting into an area where we really do want and need to potentially manage the strength distribution a little bit more. Now, I want to be careful. And this is where we always have to pull ourselves out of the bonsai hole, right? We get into the myopic vortex or the black hole of thought process where we're just cutting and pruning and cutting and pruning, and pretty soon we step back and we recognize we've cut off a lot of the growth that is contributing to the ramification and the expansion of this tree. And none of my operations that I'm performing today are being performed for a reason of cutting for the sake of cutting or cutting for the sake of balance. I am cutting for the sake of improving the aesthetic and the repercussion of that. The boundary of how far I cut and how much I cut is the even distribution of foliar mass. That is what is gained from this application. But this is aesthetically driven, and this is the beauty of bonsai, because when you start to say, well, how far? How much do you cut off? How far do you go? Well, how do you achieve the same aesthetic from the left side and the bottom branches to the apex and the right side of the tree? Aesthetically, you're answering that question because we need to have even distribution. And functionally, that creates a photosynthetically efficient tree. But beyond that, it also builds the most beautiful aesthetic that that tree could have because your value of positive space is now equal across the tree. Every branch that has foliar mass has the same quantity of foliar mass, right? And that's where we're able to shorten those bigger, longer fronds, right? And then all of a sudden we start to say, oh, no, I see how that unifies the aesthetic and the design. Cool. And that's all being driven not by some notion of physiologically what are we supposed to be doing. It's being driven by what looks the coolest, right? And what achieves the aesthetic result that we're striving for, okay? And the technical knowledge of now how the foliar mass works allows us to perform those functions and those decisions in a far more educated manner. Okay, so we're going to stagger. Again, I've got these interior branches, and at some point we have to recognize in the developmental form of the tree, right, that we have more than we actually need on this tree, and in having more than we actually need, we will be reducing some of these structural components and changing to a degree the behavior and the layout and the design of the tree. But where we are at now, we're definitely not looking or not at a point where reducing the structural branching, unless it is flawed to a degree that it's causing an immediate structural problem, we're not at a point where we want to be reducing the energy in this system. In fact, we are just starting to reach peak performance and ramping up. But if we can go ahead and continue to maintain a grasp of the necessity for our design to have photosynthetic efficiency, for our design to be sustainably designed, so that the pieces of growth underneath these branches are getting what they need, the pieces of growth that exist around these branches have the capacity to thrive and survive, and that also starts to influence how much we cut to create sustainable design and look at that overall design over the course of time. If we keep that in mind, then we're always going to be able to bridge that gap between the aesthetic and the horticulture and drive forward the tree's ability to continue driving the boat. And we say driving the boat, the tree really dictating the aesthetic decisions that are being made based on the strength, based on the bud placement, and based on that photosynthetic system. So by pulling this piece back, now all of a sudden this piece down below it, which is slightly weaker, but coming off of a completely different trunk and coming off of a trunk in a multi-trunk form, and let me just show you this, okay? We've got this multi-trunk form here. Well, this is our dominant trunk right here. And we know that in a multi-trunk form or a multiple apice form, the way that the dominant trunk stays dominant is it has the most branches and it has the most foliage. And when we start to get into a design like this where this piece is being shadowed by these pieces above it, we start to see this trunk. Look at how much foliar mass is attached to this trunk. That's a lot of the foliar mass of the tree right there. And when we look at the main tree and we're saying, look at how much foliar mass is on the main tree, that's not very much foliar mass if it's going to stay the dominant component. Oh my gosh, Ryan Neal, are you saying that we have to understand how to prune Don Redwood while we're considering foliar distribution and sustainable design? This is impossible. No. It's not impossible. It's just bonsai. This is just bonsai. And there are levels to the game. And we understand that there are levels to the game, and we accept that there are levels to the game. And the reason that you're tuning in and building your skills with Mirai Live is because you understand there are levels to the game and you want to raise your level. That's what we're doing here, okay? So even inside all of the nuances of just trying to understand Don Redwood, Metasequoia glyptostroboides, we still have to be considering all of those other pieces of asymmetry in the design, of design sustainability, of the formation of a triangular pattern in elongating species, and, oh, guess what? Multiple apices. Got to keep in mind that the dominant piece has to stay dominant, okay? But rapidly, distribution of energy is being rapidly achieved via the way that we're handling this, the reduction of the pieces that can't be utilized, okay? And up here in the apex, we're getting such strong growth on these pieces that as we start to thin this out and reduce it, it is starting to check that distribution and it will start to reallocate energy towards that dominant trunk because these pieces that have so much foliar mass on them, we are significantly reducing them. I don't want them to continue to elongate. I don't want them to continue to be super gigantic. And in fact, I think we even come back in here and let's just take a look at this. Lonnie, can you blast into this area right here? Let me go ahead and just drop that out of your way. Just right there. Let me put that against the background right there. Yeah, perfect, okay? Now here's a situation, let me pull that out of the way. Okay, here's a situation where we didn't have any of this interior growth when we wired this. This was a singular branch wired out to the tip. Now all of this is new growth, okay? And these interior pieces are equally as strong as these exterior pieces. Now I've already shortened them, but this is on that dominant trunk that connects to all of those other pieces. Now that we have big, strong interior pieces here, to come back and shorten that apical region improves the strength of branches below it, but also continues to hold this trunk in check and improves the quality of the apex by cutting out that length. So when we zoom back out, I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drop this apex back to those stronger interior pieces. These are some of those decisions. As we start to build that strength and that interior presence, and we start to manage that energy system, okay? Now all of a sudden when I take that out, we say out, in, and back out. We go out. As soon as I'm done with this, you'll see this go in, and then you'll see this come back out. That's the movement. That's the moment right there. Okay, this is that defining branch that we pruned already. So we're getting really, really close. Let's continue working these interior spaces. Let's see what we can get done in terms of these regions right here. Okay, so I've got some really beautiful, nice, strong pieces up in the apex here. I'm just going to take a little bit of that off. I'm going to take some of these pieces that feel a little bit leggy. Okay, and I've got a lot of different interacting components up in this apical region that I need to make clean, that I need to find a relationship. I have to find the space for them. I have to find the strength distribution that allows them to all thrive. Okay, and I've got a little bit of a reduction in the structural element that I'm just going to take back right there. Boom. Yeah, I feel like that probably is enough. That feels good. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rotate to the back. We're going to go and continue on the staggered effect. Okay, now when we start to say staggered effect, okay, I'm going to go ahead and show this. Yeah, perfect. Stay right there. Josh, bring me in here. Okay, I've got a piece on the left here. I've got a piece on the right. I've got another piece on the right, and I've got an area here where I have a right and a left. Okay, so I don't mind the fact that I go left, right, right, and then I've got opposing pieces. Okay, I'm going to keep the right and the right because I don't have anything on the left to create the stagger. But I go left, right, right, and I'm going to save the left so the right piece comes off. I'm going to save the right so the left piece comes off. And now I get to my fork at the tip. That's the stagger. Left, right, left, right, boom, fork. Okay, and now on this fork, I can move this into space a little bit. This is very, very strong, so I'm going to cut this back to the interior pieces of ramification. Boom, boom. And now we've checked that area. We've worked it into the aesthetic. We've got a lot of strength out here. I've got pieces at the crotch right here. I'm going to take the pieces at the crotch out. Okay, I've got three pieces here. I'm going to take it down to 2. Okay, and now I've got this big. Look at how robust this is. Go ahead and zoom out just a little bit. Pull back a little bit. There you go. Look at how robust this is. This might be the most robust branch or second to the most robust branch on the tree. Okay, I'm going to come back to that stagger. Right, left, so the right comes off. Okay, right, so the left comes off. Left, so the right comes off. And now I've got a trio right here. Now I've got another branch on the interior bottom piece comes off. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create room by taking off the piece of ramification that's growing towards that interior. Okay, now on this interior piece, I have left, 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 and then I've got left again, and then a fork. Nothing I can do about that. There's no fixing that. There's no changing that. But I can go ahead and I can control the length and strength of that piece to be subordinate to this more dominant branch. Okay? And when I start to look at this dominant branch, my piece here is ramifying at the tip. I see no buds back in and along that piece. I cannot shorten that. It is what it is. Okay? I just have to decide, do I want that big dominant piece, and do I want this big tip? I actually think it's going to be far better to cut that back and really reduce the strength and the density that exists in that area back to a much more functional amount of foliar mass, proportional to the area and proportional to the strength of the other regions around the tree. I'm going to start to do the same thing as I elevate. Okay? Pieces come off the bottom. Anywhere where I've got those pieces on the shoulder of branches that are established, anywhere where I have branches established, I'm going to take off opposing pieces and fronds. Okay? Really, really clarifying. Clarify, clean, distribute. Think about your energy system. Think about the sustainability. Think about how we maximize and utilize Don Redwood. Okay? None of these pieces at the top, they're ramifying at the tip. They don't really have buds towards the interior. I'm going to leave those. I'm going to let those construct. I'm going to let those build. Okay? When we get out here, this piece has already been handled. I have a vertical piece right here that I'm going to take out. Out you go. I'm going to lean on this branch right here. Okay? We've got another area right here that does have 3, and this is where we start to talk about, hey, when we get these structural regions, and I'm just going to show you this, it's a little bit, there's a lot of lines in this tree. Okay, let me show. Okay, right here, I've got this structural region where I have 1, 2, and 3. And they're very, very close in proximity. And this is starting to bulge right here. I'm going to go ahead and at this point, with this foliar mass and the strength that exists here, even though this is a relatively fresh styling, this was only done last year, okay? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start to take out that structural piece, okay? I take that out, now I can come back and just give that a nice clean cut. Okay, I love that. And now that allows me to balance and distribute again. So I go right, left, right, I take off the left, boom, boom. Okay, now I'm out at the fork. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to drop the fork back a little bit. Just going to take a little bit out of this. I don't want these to continue to elongate as much as they have. Right? Now I'm up in the apical region. I've got this really beautiful, nice, strong piece right here, but I don't want this to be super strong. I'm going to hold that back a little bit. Apically dominant, Don Redwood. We're going to be definitely checking that strength. I get out into this region. I've got a vertically growing piece right here. I'm going to take that back. And then I've got these longer pieces here. I'm going to take these back. I'm going to take these back. I'm going to leave a little bit of a moderate count there, okay? Now you'll notice when I take back these really young pieces, I'm not necessarily focused as much on the stagger right here because that tissue is really, really raw and really, really young. Okay, it's just now bronzing up or maybe bronzed up a few weeks ago. To pull that, I run the risk of damaging that tissue on that soft, fleshy branch. When it's woody and when it's lignified, I'm comfortable doing that. Right now, it's still a little raw, it's still a little young, okay? And that brings us, oh, what a darling tree. What a journey this has been, okay? This brings us back to the front and back to these pieces that have the most significant foliar load on the tree. And we've got to start making decisions. Again, we get into these areas where we have these groups of 3. Now, this is an interesting scenario here because I have this junction of 3. The piece that is wired has not performed as well as the 2 pieces around it that don't have wire. So I'm going to take that wire back. I'm going to take off this piece that's around it, and I'm just going to use this. Now, I don't want to be wiring Don Redwood right now, and I'm sure this is a question. When do we wire Don Redwood? You want to be wiring Don Redwood in the spring before it pushes growth so that you don't damage all of these branches. A lot of people try to wire Don Redwood when they're full of foliar mass, and you just destroy. You're like a wrecking ball for the foliar mass of the tree. Now, it can be done. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying that if you want to maximize Don Redwood, you want to be doing that work when they are out of leaf, not when they are in leaf, so that you do the least amount of damage. If you do it while they are in leaf, you have to apply supreme technique, supreme wiring technique, because you cannot be damaging all of these pieces of growth, or else you're wiping out ramification and you're taking the tree backwards instead of forwards. I will be honest with you. Michael's a talented student. He wired this tree while it was in foliar mass, and still, because of his technique, he was able to have success and set it up to really thrive. So that was, kudos to his technique and the success that technique allowed him to have. But I would say ideals in terms of working Don Redwood would not be to be wiring it while it is in actual leaf mass, okay? Even these pieces up at the top here, as strong as they are not producing buds as far back on the interior as I would assume, but they are capable of being shortened and the strength is capable of being checked, and because they're in the apical region and it is an apically dominant tree, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to execute just a little bit of reduction, just a little bit of strength check and strength balancing, energy distribution, foliar mass distribution, continuing the cleaning process. And we're almost there, and you've stuck with me the entire time. I appreciate it very much. Okay, pruning that tip, looking for those buds, shortening that. Again, apical region, really, really strong. Let's be super accurate in the way that we handle this area up here. And finally, last but definitively not least, we are at the apex of the tree. And this area of the tree wasn't necessarily as strong as you would expect typical apices to be in an apically dominant tree. And so I would say up in here, let's be a little bit careful. Okay, we talked about the fact that this dominant trunk didn't necessarily have the majority of the foliar mass on it. And by leaving that apex, and you can see the apex doesn't necessarily stand out as an overly dense region compared to the other areas. In fact, I think your densest region probably comes from the appearance, the overlap of these two areas. But when I change that, you recognize even that is fairly evenly distributed throughout the tree. But a really nice discussion, a really nice exploration, a really nice technical, a really nice design-oriented stream just to really dig into Metasequoia glyptostroboides, the youth of the foliage and how we handle that, the maturation process and the opportunities that brings. And then in terms of design, how we can handle and consider those pieces when we prune Dawn Redwood, how we prune Dawn Redwood, and when we think about the timing for that wiring and styling to maximize what we gain each year through this evolutionary process of taking advantage of maximizing, distributing the energy, and perpetuating the enhanced ramification that builds this into a truly world-class species to build bonsai with. Deciduous conifers, our larches, our bald cypress, and our Dawn Redwoods, these are three really interesting and unique varieties that we have the opportunity to work with. You now have the tools in your toolkit to understand, better utilize, and strategize to predict the outcome of your actions on this tree.